Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview with renowned logistics expert, Professor Alan McKinnon, where we'll delve into one of the most pressing issues facing modern transport and logistics, balancing the goals of connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience. This is especially important for emerging economies, as achieving this balance can create an opportunity to steer the rapidly developing freight sectors towards a sustainable future. Today's discussion will offer fresh insights into how connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience interact. We'll explore synergies that can help policymakers and private sector leaders address the environmental, economic, and social challenges posed by global freight transport. We'll also identify when and how to handle trade-offs between these concepts. My name is Yaroslav Kholodov, and I'm a policy analyst at the International Transport Forum, or ITF. This is an intergovernmental organization composed of 69 member countries that acts as a global policy think tank. Our mission is to facilitate the exchange of insights and ideas to improve transport systems worldwide. This interview complements the recently launched ITF Special Academic Lecture Series under the SIPA, Sustainable Infrastructure Program in Asia. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Alan McKinnon, the author of the new ITF paper, which is called Evaluating the Relationships Between Connectivity, Decarbonization, and Resilience in Freight Transport, Applications to Central and Southeast Asia. Professor McKinnon's career began in 1979. He has held significant roles at the University of Leicester, Heriot-Watt University, and Kuehne Logistics University in Hamburg. Professor McKinnon has advised leading international organizations such as the European Commission, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the OECD. He has also received numerous awards, including the prestigious Sir Robert Lawrence Award, for the positive impact his expertise has had on logistics and transport. His research covers sustainable logistics, freight transport policy, and environmental impacts. Welcome, Professor McKinnon.
Thank you. Good morning, Yaroslav, and thank you for that introduction. It's been a pleasure taking part in this project.
Wonderful to have you here as well. Thank you. So, Alan, if you don't mind, we can just jump right into our dialogue. So maybe I can open it with the first question, and that would be just understanding the link between these three entities, which are connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience in freight transport, and why these interconnections matter. Over to you.
Yes. So currently in the freight transport planning and policy world, these three entities, connectivity, decarbonization, resilience, feature very prominently in discussions and in debates. Maybe it would be helpful at the start for maybe to define these terms, because you mentioned the papers that have been written for the ITF SIPA program. So there have been papers specifically written on connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience, and they each contain definitions. So in the case of connectivity, that is defined as the efficiency and effectiveness of infrastructure and services that facilitate the movement of goods across various transport modes within and between countries. Quite a comprehensive definition. In the case of decarbonization, it's simply reducing carbon emissions from freight transport systems and operations. And then in the case of resilience, that is the ability to cope with, recover from, and adapt to external shocks to freight transport networks. Right? So now it's interesting that policies in these three areas have slightly different motivations. So in the case of connectivity, I think that's seen mainly in economic terms as something which can enhance the process of economic development. In the case of decarbonization, that's clearly an environmental imperative, as we're trying to manage the climate crisis. And then in the case of resilience, it's related to the security and robustness of economic and social systems as well. Now, one of the problems is that transport policymaking in this area has been a bit siloed, where these three things have different objectives. And often I don't think there's been sufficient consideration of the interconnections between these three policy goals. And as a result, there's a failure to recognize that there are some potential conflicts between these areas of policy. So what the study does really is look at the interdependencies between the three: connectivity, decarbonization, resilience, looks at the potential conflicts, but also the potential synergies as well, which also could be exploited, and encouraging policymakers to take a more holistic view of these three entities and just to make policymakers more aware of the way in which they can interact in the sort of policy arena.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a really good intro. And of course, we'll delve into each of these sort of pillars, if I may say, a little bit later. But maybe also revising the context, right, in which we were looking at these interconnections. And since, our project and our paper is looking at Central and Southeast Asia, so how do these interconnections look like in these two regions, and what makes these regions important to this study?
Yeah. So the framework and the methodology which I discuss in the paper is pretty generic and really could be applied to any region or country. But you're right, there are special circumstances, it seems to me, in these two regions, which makes this work particularly appropriate at the present time. So if we look at what I call the three entities, first of all, connectivity. In these regions, there's a lot of investment going into transport infrastructure, to improve connectivity, big efforts to integrate these regions more fully into global supply chains and value chains, so that their connectivity is rapidly increasing. On decarbonisation, the Asia-Pacific region, according to the available statistics, accounts for about a third of transport-related emissions. And what is a bit unusual is that freight accounts for a very high proportion of those emissions. Worldwide, freight represents, I think, about 42% of transport emissions. In the Asia-Pacific region, it's over 50%. And also the projections suggest that the rate at which freight-related emissions will grow is higher in these regions than they will be in other parts of the world. And then on resilience, these regions are relatively vulnerable. First of all, to extreme weather events associated with climate change. We've recently seen very serious flooding in Vietnam, for example, as a result of Typhoon Yagi. But the dense populations in relatively low-lying areas, again, are going to make these areas vulnerable to climate change. In the case of Central Asia, that is exposed to geopolitical risk, as we have seen following the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. There's a shift to different transport and trade routes as well. So the resilience features very prominently in the way that freight transport is managed in these regions. So if we look at each of these entities individually, one can see that they are important in these regions. Then if you look at the interdependence between them, again, there are complications here, I think, that we don't necessarily observe in other parts of the world.
These are great insights into the regional context as well, right? So now that we have kind of like an overall understanding of these concepts, right? A more holistic approach, as you say, to regional freight planning. Maybe we could also ask you about your assessments, right? So from a freight transport policy perspective, how well aligned are these objectives to increase connectivity, reduce carbon emissions, but also improve resilience?
Well, this is the key issue that I address in the paper. Maybe I should give a brief explanation as to how I went about trying to answer this question. What I did was I looked at a series of attributes for each of the three entities, for connectivity, for decarbonisation, and for resilience. I estimated that there are 8 attributes for connectivity, there are 5 for decarbonisation, and there are 6 for resilience. I then constructed a framework that would look at the interconnections between these attributes. I reckon there are about 35 interconnections that are significant for freight transport policy making. I then mapped those interactions and I classified them into 3 categories. First of all, those interactions which are synergistic, where they are mutually reinforcing. Second ones are the ones where there's an evidence of a conflict and therefore trade-offs will have to be made. And then the third category are what I call hybrid ones, where the interconnection can either be mutually reinforcing or it could be in conflict. And that varies really with local and national circumstances, right? And then when I classified them, what I found was about 2/3 of these interrelationships were mutually reinforcing. Good news, right? About 11% of them were in conflict, and then the remainder, that's about a quarter, fell into that hybrid category. But it's very hard to generalize. It depends very much on the local circumstances. So, the message is then for policymakers is obviously to try to maximize the synergies that you obtain from this, but also to be aware that some of these policies will be conflicting, and therefore you have to somehow trade off between the different policy objectives.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, this is a really good coverage of, I think, of the core contribution of this paper, really trying to put that into one singular framework, right? And personally, this is my favorite part, especially this very complex diagram showing how many intertwined connections there are between these entities, right? And I hope by looking through and trying to sort of untangle these interconnections, the policymakers can make more informed decisions, right? So to say, also ex post prior to decision making and implementation. So maybe we can delve into this a little bit more right now, and starting with the brighter side. So discussing, the mutual benefits or synergies between, better connectivity, but also decarbonization in freight transport. So let's say, how can we improve transport networks, but also reduce emissions from this process?
That's right. So I'll focus on some of the what I call synergies. One would be the connection between multimodality, which is one of the attributes of connectivity, and another would be freight modal shift. Because if we want to decarbonize freight transport, we want to try and push as much freight as possible onto lower carbon transport modes. So there's an obvious interconnection there. So, where a country or a region invest more heavily in rail and waterway networks, whose carbon intensity is well below that of road, then we will shift freight in that direction. That will increase the connectivity of the network, but it will also result in lower carbon emissions. Another example would be increasing the carrying capacity of a road network, for example, because if you then relieve congestion bottlenecks, it will be possible for freight vehicles to travel at more fuel efficient speeds, so less fuel will be consumed, and so carbon emissions will reduce. And another aspect of connectivity, which is often not included in the standard definitions, is access to battery charging facilities or to refueling facilities for biofuels, for example, because obviously one of the main ways in which we're going to decarbonize freight transport is in transitioning away from fossil fuel towards renewable energy. But to do that, we will have to equip our transport infrastructure with a capability to recharge trucks and to allow them to switch to alternative fuels. So building up that aspect of capability, I think, will also have a direct benefit for the decarbonisation of freight transport.
Thank you, Alan. These are great examples. And now maybe we can also look at the other sides of these interconnections, which are trade-offs, right? So there is a few of them highlighted in the paper. So also the trade-offs that exist between connectivity and decarbonization. Maybe you can explain what are the potential conflicts there are in more detail?
Yeah, certainly. Because one of the main decarbonisation attributes is managing the future demand for freight transport, either to restrain the future growth of freight transport or even to reverse that growth. But if we improve the connectivity of transport networks, what we do is we reduce transit times, we reduce the cost of transport, and companies then take advantage of that in sourcing their products over longer distances or centralizing their production and their warehousing, which allows them to enjoy economies of scale, but in the process generates additional freight movement. So there's an obvious conflict there because that will then generate more freight traffic and there'll be more related CO2 emissions. However, I think that requires some qualifications, because it depends on the way in which connectivity is increased. And it gets back to the point I mentioned in an earlier answer. If we invest sufficiently in road and rail networks, the networks then which carry freight at a lower carbon intensity, then that will tend to relieve that pressure. If much of the additional freight movements that generated goes by rail or waterway, for example, again, that will mitigate the effects of improved connectivity on decarbonisation. Another issue which I think needs to be considered, and this gets back to how you scope the calculation of CO2 emissions from freight transport. If we extend the calculation beyond direct carbon emissions from freight transport to look at the embedded emissions in the products that are transported, what you then find is that if you increase connectivity, then that can allow companies or consumers to obtain lower carbon products from more distant locations. So we're not just looking at the freight transport emissions, we're looking at the emissions from production operations in different regions, different countries. And I think if you do the calculation on that basis, what you discover is that sourcing some products over longer distances from lower carbon production locations can actually have a reducing effect on CO2 emissions. So I think if we move to a life cycle type of analysis of decarbonisation, then I think a lot of the current increase in freight movement can actually be justified.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alan. Yes, and I'm pleased to hear that, your paper also takes a very progressive approach, forward-looking approach, so to say, right? Incorporating these life cycle practices, which we, of course, all would like to adopt. But of course, there are certain limitations and challenges to that. But I think it's already good to start the discussion right now and try to build on that. So we've touched upon connectivity and decarbonization now, but there's a third entity, right, which is resilience. And it's also a major theme in your paper. So is there a close alignment between efforts to make freight transport systems more resilient and lower carbon?
Generally speaking, yes. Which again is a positive conclusion I come to in the paper. If we look at the ways in which we can improve the resilience of freight transport systems and supply chains, I'll just focus on three. One that's often advocated is to source more product locally, to shorten supply chains, or some people refer to this as supply chain compression. The argument is that that will then reduce the risk, but it will also then reduce the amount of freight movement, and there'll be carbon benefits from that. The only problem with this is it's a bit of an oversimplification. A lot of supply chain risk is country or location or supplier specific. It's not simply a function of the distance over which the products are moved. And therefore, while it's likely there'll be some alignment, it's not a perfect alignment by any means. Second way in which you can improve the resilience of a freight transport system is encouraging companies to use more than one transport mode, right? So you diversify the sourcing of freight transport by mode and by carrier, and that then spreads the risk of a freight transport disruption. But even that requires a qualification because it depends very much on the differing risk profiles of the different transport modes. So in decarbonisation terms, it would be desirable to get a lot more freight onto the rail network. But if in a particular country or region, the railways are more vulnerable to extreme weather events, for example, then you wouldn't have alignment. There would actually be a bit of a conflict between those two objectives. And then the third example I will use is just in time, because just in time replenishment of supplies, which has been in place now in most countries and most industrial sectors for decades. I mean, this is a widely accepted business paradigm, where you minimize inventory and you closely couple processes. It makes a lot of sense in economic terms, but unfortunately it exposes supply chains to a bit more risk, as we have seen during the pandemic. So some people are arguing that to improve resilience, we need to relax the just-in-time principle. But it's also interesting to note that just-in-time gets blamed for a lot of the underutilization of freight capacity. Also, it results in more freight going by faster, more energy efficient, more energy intensive transport modes than so people argue that if we relax just-in-time, we'll get a carbon benefit as well as a risk reduction benefit. But again, every time there's a but. The but in this case is that just in time is more than just a delivery system. It's a whole business philosophy, right? Deeply embedded in the way companies manage their production and their logistics. And it's aimed at minimizing waste. And that includes minimizing energy consumption. So the danger is, by relaxing just in time, we may reduce carbon emissions from transport, but at an industry level or a production level, we may see it actually increase emissions. So therefore, we've got to be very careful, I think, in discussing these alignments between resilience and decarbonisation.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing these insights and sort of for challenging more conventional or common, concepts that exist in the industry. And I think for the audience, I hope this will stir some thoughts and new ideas, since I believe among the three pillars, resilience is the least explored or the least, sort of adopted with resilience strategies and policies. So I believe that is the part that might draw most attention. Moving on, another interesting detail in your paper is actually a framework for quantifying, these interrelations. So you also suggest a set, and quite an extensive actually set, for metrics to assess these three pillars, right? So what is the exact purpose of these assessments? And, as with any quantitative exercise, how to ensure its feasibility?
Good points, yeah. So my assessment of these 35 interrelationships between connectivity, decarbonisation and resilience is based on subjective judgment. I mean, these are qualitative assessments, they're descriptive, but the analysis could be made more rigorous, it seems to me, if we could quantify the attributes for the three entities, connectivity, decarbonisation and resilience, and then subject them to statistical or mathematical modelling. Now, to help in that process, where we move from essentially a qualitative to a quantitative approach to doing this, I, in the paper, include a list of potential metrics that we can use for the attributes. So I've got 17 metrics I propose for connectivity, there are 23 for decarbonisation, and there are 18 for resilience. So that's a total of 58 potential metrics. So, for example, in the case of connectivity, one of the metrics would be the density of a transport network, which would be the route kilometres relative to the square miles served by that network. Decarbonisation, an example there would, under the vehicle utilisation attribute, would be the proportion of truck kilometres that are on empty. And then for resilience, one of my resilience metrics would be the proportion of ton kilometres where the origin and destination is within a country as opposed to crossing an international frontier, right? So they're just some examples. I have to say it's quite challenging coming up with metrics for several reasons. First of all, just trying to translate an abstract concept into a practical indicator of some sort is a challenge, more so for some than others. Secondly, some of the attributes are essentially multidimensional, right? And therefore you would require several metrics, I think, to capture the essence of that attribute. But the biggest constraint, it seems to me, is in actually obtaining the data to calibrate these metrics, because my paper is essentially a macro level paper, right? It's taking a broad country view of all of this. And as I think we well know, there are major deficiencies in governmental freight statistics for countries, and particularly in lower income countries, where they don't have the same capability to collect and analyze data that you find in more developed countries. But going beyond that, there are some of my metrics which you would never really expect a government to collect annually, right? I think additional surveys will be required of businesses, to calibrate some of these metrics, particularly relating to resilience, for example, right? Because resilience isn't just a freight transport issue, it's a broader supply chain issue. And to do that, we've got to get a better understanding of how companies are managing their supply chains. So it's a challenge, but hopefully that won't deter people in the next phase of this work to start to quantify this modeling.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, that's a very good point. And as a transport modeler and as an analyst myself, I can relate to all of this, strengths and sort of the support that the metrics can bring to policy dialogue, but also all the challenges associated with it, especially in emerging economies. But what I like about your framework is that it really has a layered approach to it, right? It's having very sort of general and very accessible metrics that can be implemented and produced right away in most of the countries, but also a little bit more ambitious to really, endorse more detailed, more expansive data collection and also data exchange among the countries in the region, right? So that it can be more uniform. So another interesting point that you touched upon while discussing this concept is the important alignment of transport networks and the economic geography of the regions they serve. So maybe you can share a couple of ideas how this can be better achieved, and if there is any role that policymaking can play in it.
Yeah. So spatial alignment, between the configuration of a transport network and the distribution of economic activity is again one of the fundamental attributes here. And in some countries, particularly some developed countries, one thing you find is a misalignment between, for example, the rail network and the current distribution of economic activity, because as investment has gone in to improve the road network, a lot of new development of factories and warehouses has gravitated to points of high accessibility on the road network. And as a consequence, this legacy rail network is, in the wrong locations really to capture much of that business. You ask, how do we deal with this problem? I think we can use land use planning for this purpose, right? If countries have a land use planning system that promotes the clustering of industrial and logistics development near multimodal hubs, where the factories and warehouses can gain easy access, to a range of different transport modes. I think that can help to deal with that problem. But we also have to ensure that we've got a sufficient density of intermodal transfer points in our networks to allow freight to switch between the modes. So I touched quite a bit of importance, perhaps because I began my life as a geographer, right? That land use planning, it seems to me, is a critical role to play in dealing with the issue that you've just described.
Great, Alan. Thank you. And maybe moving towards the last question now. So, you've presented a lot of conceptual ideas, right, and how to quantify the interconnections between these three entities, and also certain solutions, right, for improving and striking the right balance for maximizing the truly sustainable benefits, right, between improved connectivity, decarbonization, and stronger resilience. But from my observations, most of these solutions are quite long term, right? So they involve a lot of investments and usually in hard infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
But are there any sort of quick gains or low hanging fruits, so to say, for some short or medium term planning phase that the governments, businesses can adopt as quickly as possible?
Yep. Depends how you define infrastructure here, because you're right, in the popular mind, infrastructure is conceived to be major road and rail construction plans, which you're right, can take years to develop with large amounts of capital investment. And you can't change that necessarily in the short term. But in my paper, I use a sort of broader definition of infrastructure, right? And there are some forms of infrastructural improvement there which could be developed and applied in the short to medium term, often at lower cost. So digitalization, for example, building up the digital capabilities of freight transport systems has been shown obviously to improve the efficiency, the utilization of the assets, which then translates into lower emissions, but also increases risk visibility and also makes it easier to manage the network in the event of a disruption. And what we have seen developing quite rapidly in many parts of the world, including the regions that we're focusing on here, is the digitalization of freight markets and freight operations, but also energy related things as well. In an earlier answer, I mentioned the need for us to transition to renewable energy. So again, in the short to medium term, you can build up capability to refuel with biofuels or to recharge vehicles. So these things can be more incremental, and yet they're pretty fundamental, I think, to moving to this new world where our freight transport systems are lower carbon and a lot more resilient than they are today.
Great. Yeah, these are very important, but also very helpful suggestions. And of course, there is much more out there in the paper. So of course, I invite everyone to go and get acquainted with the full work of Professor McKinnon. So thank you very much. I think our interview has come to an end. So I appreciate you sharing valuable insights with us. And on behalf of the ITF, we deeply appreciate your contribution to the SIPA program and these regional projects. And of course, just as the global community, helping them to understand the sustainable regional freight connectivity as a whole. So also for our audience, as we wrap up, I'd like to remind that our series of 4 methodological papers, including the one we discussed today, it's already available for download via the link on your screens. And you can also find the previous lectures in this series on freight connectivity, sustainability, and resilience on the ITF's YouTube channel. So I invite you also to follow us and stay in the loop, since we have a few more upcoming publications later this year, but also in 2025 under the SIPA. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today and wish you a wonderful day wherever you may be. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.